The content of this podcast is based on medical fact and evidence-based practice from credible authoritative sources, but is not a substitute for your institution's policies, procedures, common sense, or good judgment. The views and opinions are those of Eric Bauer and FlightBridgeED in their entirety. This is the FlightBridgeED Podcast, critical care and emergency medicine education for nurses and paramedics. Here's your host, Eric Bauer.
Hey everybody, Eric back with you. Today's podcast is going to be a little bit different. Very excited to be able to have Kevin Hazzard, the author of American Siren. And you've probably seen this book or seen the buzz about this book on maybe different social media threads. I saw this initially on Amazon. It was put out September 20th. So I just want to welcome Kevin, and looking forward to hearing about your journey writing this book, a little bit about your background. I think we come from the same beginnings, and excited to have you on the show.
Yeah, man, glad to be here.
Can you just really quickly tell the audience, a little bit about yourself, where you came from, your history as a paramedic, and how we got to here?
Yeah, so, like a lot of other people, watched towers come down on 9/11, felt like what I was doing in life was not quite enough, or at least that it wasn't something that was larger than me. Wasn't sure what that larger than me would be, or at least what I was looking for, and then stumbled through a very weird circumstance, stumbled across EMS and realized that this could be my chance. And so pretty much, in a very short period of time, quit my job and was in EMT school. And it all happened so quickly that, I remember sitting there that first night thinking, like, what the hell did I just do? Like, it was really kind of shocking. But I loved it. Initially I was terrified, but by the end of that class, I was so excited for it. And, I knew if you live in the city of Atlanta, Grady is the place you want to be. And so that was where I set my sights. Back when I started, you could not get hired on at Grady without experience. So got a job just running Fulton County 911 ambulances. Rural Metro ran them. Did that for a little while, long enough that Grady would take my phone calls, and then switched over, went to paramedic school, and, rode out there for a while. It was great. All in, it was 10 years. And, after I left, I didn't know what to make of that decade. I think a lot of us sort of look at what this career is, both the negatives and the positives, and it's sort of this weird, jumble-y, slurry, like I don't even exactly know how to put a name on what this thing is or what it was or what it meant to me. And my way to process stuff is just to write. And the process, the outcome of that was 1,000 Naked Strangers. And somebody who read the book sent me an email and said, hey, I read your story. It was good, but like, do you know how it began? And he mentioned Freedom House in this email. And of course, I'd never heard of Freedom House. Started digging into it and immediately fell down a hole that, only a lot of research and writing would get me out of. And the result of that is you and I sitting here today talking.
Well, I think when we talked, we did a pre-show Zoom meeting a couple weeks ago, and I had to admit that I hadn't heard of the Freedom House. I've shared many times on the podcast my background as a young kid. I wanted to be a paramedic, and I've always thought that paramedicine started with Johnny and Roy, per se, Los Angeles County Fire. And I think this story really highlights that that's not the case. And so I think that's where I'm intrigued about maybe the forgotten, right? I think you said that very perfectly on our interview, that this is a story that you just had to tell, right? And so I think that's really my motivation of having you on the show, is I think right now, specifically in the United States and around the world, is we have a huge focus right now on diversity. And, one of my closest friends and mentors is African-American. And I just feel like there's, whether you're Hispanic or Asian or, Caucasian, we all have played a role in this country, in this world. And I think it's just important that we are able to tell those stories. So I applaud you for, that spark. That sounds like that kind of happened by chance, right? You wrote a book about your experience, and then all of a sudden you're going down a rabbit hole of something you never expected. So that's cool.
Yeah. It's funny. Everybody talks about emergency, and there's this great thing that I found in Nancy Caroline's archives, and how fitting that it would be in Nancy's, because, there are two things, emergency and her book, right? Like that television show, that book, those are the two things that everybody in this field kind of points to. That is our sort of common origin story. And in her archives, she has this article from Pittsburgh Magazine. It was 1978. And it was the first time that she wrote about this experience. And the result of that experience, of course, was the book. But this was her beginning to tell the world about this thing that she had done and editorialize it. And she ends it with a story of her and a couple of Freedom House paramedics sitting around one night watching an episode of Emergency. And, here are these guys who in 1967 birthed this thing. And one of them, halfway through the show, one of them just sort of turned and to nobody said, I wonder if they know. Here, everybody's watching this television show right now. And they're seeing this thing. They're seeing this crazy thing that's happening out there. And I wonder if they have any idea where it started, that it started here with us. The story then was no, or the answer then was no. The answer now is no. And that's really, to me, that's always been the thing, is these guys did this thing, and they always kind of looked around and said, does anybody know that we did this?
Well, obviously you went through EMT school, right? And that's where we were supposed to learn the foundation, the white paper. I mean, this Freedom House and these paramedics predated that, right?
Yeah, I mean,
so it's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, the white paper ends up being, part of the impetus to create this thing. It sort of helped Safran in a certain way, because it gave him an extra piece of ammunition. But somehow we leap from white paper to Johnny and Roy. There's, or at least to Los Angeles or Miami, or, a leap is made. And, this crucial piece of the history is just sort of, swept aside.
Well, so very cool. So can you just take us through the history of these paramedics? Obviously I think this is a must read. Got to read the book. I've had some friends reach out and they listened to an audiobook and just raved about it. So I think the feedback that I've gotten, I haven't gotten through all the book, as I told you, right? Been a busy last couple months, but what I've read so far has been pretty powerful. Just take us through really from the idea, your research, and then the things that really came to light through your, looking into this and then putting the book together.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, we all understand 1965. We get what the white paper said. But, there's, I guess the first point is what brought us to that moment. And what brought us to that moment is, weirdly enough, World War II. So throughout human history, there are all these moments where somebody stands up and tries to create something, right? Some version of a medical system that takes place outside the hospital. And it might literally just be somebody, with a hand-carried stretcher dragging people through the cities of, ancient Italy. Or it might, be 19th century, relatively advanced for its time ambulance service that was out of Bellevue, run by doctors that had, it was horse-drawn ambulance, but they had morphine, they had equipment, they had ether, they carried a pint of brandy, just so, to treat patients. I mean, it was relatively advanced. But that's 19th century. It kept kind of popping up and then going under, popping up and going under. World War I happens, and this huge advance takes place. Everybody knows Hemingway was an ambulance driver, that he wrote, one of his first books about that experience. But That is the birth of triage. That is the birth of radio dispatched ambulance units. That is the first time that medics, not doctors or nurses, but some form of a technician is trained to treat people where they're injured and bring them to more advanced care. It continues to advance in the U.S. until World War II, which is such a massive vortex of both people and material that like everything gets sucked out. So there had been hospital-based ambulance services, city-based ambulance services, but like our grandparents, were like piecing together bits of soap, to make a bar because there was just none to be had. You couldn't get aluminum, you couldn't get rubber, you certainly couldn't get young men. So the ambulance service goes away. And at the end of the war, what is left is like funeral homes, maybe some sort of volunteer service, or the police. And they simply weren't cutting it, which again, the white paper comes out in 1965 and tells the world to nobody's shock that 2 undertakers in a hearse, driving up to your house with no equipment, no training, smelling of embalming fluid, and who stand to make significantly more money if you die right now and they get to host your funeral than they ever will for transporting you is not a good option. So, enter Peter Saffer, who's this Austrian-born anesthesiologist through, very, like by the skin of his teeth, made it through World War II unscathed and emigrated to the United States. And it's a long, complicated story, but the first thing that he does when he gets to Baltimore is invent CPR. Quite literally, all by himself, invent CPR. And, he looked at what we were doing at the time, realized it was totally useless, and said, not only is this thing useless, but I've got this new idea where I think I can keep people alive with expired air. So he sets up a series of tests in which he sedates and paralyzes his volunteers, and then tests this method, which he already knows isn't going to work. And he records it. He records, hey, this person's dying, even though I'm doing this new method. And then he, they're on all these, gauges and everything. And so you can watch the air fall out of their chest. You can watch their O2 sets plummet. And then he trots over Boy Scouts, who he gives like a quick 10-second down and dirty look. This is how you perform rescue breaths. And they do it, and they save, they bring these people essentially back from the brink of death. He does a series of 40 tests, takes that data out to the world, and the world sort of goes, holy crap, you're right, there it is, that's CPR. So he pairs the rescue breaths with chest compressions, and in one fell swoop, we have CPR. That's that's like 1958, 59. That shows how recent we are. Like all this is brand new. This job that you're doing today, it just started. It literally, like a blink of an eye ago, just began. So that's the sort of person, like that kind of, and he's 35 when he does this. He isn't some, like grand old man of medicine. Like this is a dude who's just, like he speaks heavily accented English. He's just come to this country. He's incredibly young. Nobody trusts him. And he changes the world of medicine by himself. So he reads the white paper. He witnesses, he is the receiving physician at the death of a very prominent Pittsburgher in 1966. And he knows that the reason that this guy who arrives in cardiac arrest and he gets a pulse back, he gets a blood pressure back, he gets a respiratory rate back, the guy's brain dead. And he knows the reason this man is brain dead is because there was nobody on scene in terms of transport that delivered any care. There was a nurse in the audience with this former governor, former mayor named David Lawrence drops dead. That nurse drops to the ground. She performs CPR, and the cops show up, that's what ran the ambulance service in Pittsburgh at that time. The cops show up with no equipment except a broken or empty oxygen cylinder, and then they toss him in the back of their thing, and they sped at full speed with nobody in the back. Right. This guy's up by himself. So that's why he's brain dead. Saffer knows that. So he has all this information. This is a guy who's clearly not afraid to take chances. So he sits down by himself, and he draws up the world's first fully comprehensive paramedic curriculum. It's an 8-month program that once you're out of the classroom, you will go into the OR, the ER, the ICU. You go into the OB ward. You go into the morgue so you can witness autopsies. I mean, this is if you read this training program that he developed, it is as intense as anything we have today. And the problem is he doesn't have any people to do it. So the flip side of Peter Saffer is a guy named Jim McCoy, who is a civil rights activists in the city of Pittsburgh. There's a neighborhood there called the Hill District. Again, like a long, winding story to describe the Hill, but think Harlem, think Watts, and he, the Hill was a region that had been, or a neighborhood that had been, sort of sucker punched by fate. And McCoy, more than anything, wanted to provide people living there with an opportunity. And so he creates Freedom House as a job training program. The problem is, like, he can't come up with an inspiring job for them to train for. Like, nobody will give them the opportunity to do anything really good. So this guy named Phil Hallen, who runs a medical nonprofit, approaches McCoy and says, look, man, people in the Hill District have no access to healthcare. You guys have people and you have this little training program. Like, why don't we train them to just drive trucks, and you can pick people up at their house and you can bring them to UPMC, which is University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, like one of the hospitals. How wonderful would this be? And they agree, and they have this incredibly modest proposal, and they go to Pitt with this idea to create this very, very simple toting service. And they walk through the door, and as luck would have it, one of the first people they sit down with is Peter Safar. And of course, Safar has no interest in this modest proposal of theirs. However, he's got this, groundbreaking, revolutionary idea, which he just, essentially explodes onto them. Yeah. Their minds are blown. They don't know what to make of this. They know, well, wait a minute, this sounds really complicated. We have ordinary people. We don't have medical professionals. And Safar's like, no, I want ordinary people. We've tried doctors. We've tried nurses. We know that's not going to work. There needs to be a new professional. And again, 66, when this conversation takes place, the paramedic is not a word. It's not a term that exists yet. But that's what they're discussing. That's what Safar is proposing. And specifically, if you know what a paramedic is, you know that we are not doctors, nurses. We are a separate brand of professional. And that's what Safar needed. And so he said, I don't want anybody with anything else. I want someone I can train specifically to do this job, like this incredibly important but heretofore unrealized job. And they said, fine, we'll do it. And then boom, off they go. And that's the genesis of Freedom House. Their story gets more complicated, but that's how it begins.
Wow. So from that point forward, then they select the first group. Is that correct? So kind of take us through that point.
Yeah. So, as you can imagine, putting your life on hold to take an 8-month-long training course, 5 days a week, maybe weekends, probably nights, for small pay that will finish and give you access to a job that technically does not exist, was like the world's worst sales pitch. Nobody said yes. At that point, the Hill District had a significantly higher unemployment rate than other parts of the city. And even then, people were like, nah, man, I don't, this isn't for me. So at the last second, they're literally dragging people off the street. The night before this class is going to begin, they need 48 people because they know that they're not going to, not everyone will be able to endure the intensity of this program. They're aware of that. Some people are going to wash out. So they want 24, they need 48 to 50. So they quite literally drag people off the street. Some people were offered dinner, and that was why they showed up. Anyone, that was sort of hanging out, it's a city neighborhood. So anybody out walking around or just, two guys sitting around talking, those are the kind of people they bring in. And they get this pitch and they're told, hey, this is what's going to happen in the morning. And, if you talk to those guys, most of them will tell you, I didn't know anything about medicine, didn't care anything about medicine. None of this made any sense to me. However, there was a kernel of this. If you peeled everything away, at its core, this was something important, and this was something new, and this was something that the world was not going to be able to ignore. And people were going to have to, take note of me. And for the first time, I was going to get an opportunity to prove my worth to the world. And that's why I showed up the next morning. Not because this weird guy with this crazy accent was trying to tell me that I was going to become, this new revolutionary thing. I recognized that this was going to be important, and that's why I showed up.
Wow. And so at that point, this had not become a national standard. It was not, curriculum wasn't submitted. There wasn't a national registry. There wasn't a state license. Basically, this anesthesiologist was certifying them.
Yeah, Safar, in the process of, over the next couple of years, Safar helps create National Registry with some of his contacts in Ohio, which is, I mean, that's why it is there today. So none of that existed. His thing was, let me build this thing. Let's test it, prove it, and then give it to the world. You know, he developed the Resusciani doll, which, you know, he was the one, he's having dinner one night. He's traveling the world promoting CPR. He's having dinner with Asmund Lerdahl, who at that time was running a failing toy company, and was like, hey man, I need you to make this sort of CPR doll. And he did. And so Lerdahl is now this international conglomerate.
Wow.
Saffer didn't accept any money for that. In his mind, like, medicine should be open source. So he developed this thing with the understanding that people would just borrow from it what they needed. And that was his plan. Like, here it is, I'll make it, and then you just take it and you go. You want all of it, take all of it. You want a piece, you take a piece. So there was nothing at that point. And again, he helped create National Registry, but that is, you know, a year or two down the line. So these guys head into training. They finish the classroom portion. Like I said, some of them drop out. A bunch of these guys did not have high school diplomas, so they need to get their GEDs while they're doing that, which that's an extra complication. You had guys that were just back from Vietnam. You know, it was an interesting mix of people who did this, and the 24 that completed the course then head off into the hospital. They hit the ER, they're handed mops because the nurses assume that they were orderlies. They get to OB, and the nurses literally bar the door. They won't let them in. And they wind up learning how to deliver babies by videotape. You know, before they hit the streets, they are reminded that, like, hey, you're black men in 1960s America, and so there's, you know, this is not going to be an easy ride for you. But nonetheless, they get through their training, and then April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated, and cities around the country sort of devolve into violence, Pittsburgh among them. And so that's where they run their first calls. It's kind of when they're conscripted, just before their training is to conclude.
How ironic is that?
Yeah, off they go.
Wow. Yeah, and that really shows, you know, obviously this, it's just amazing. You know, he comes up with such an amazing program, curriculum, puts them through that, but you still have the issues within the hospital and the stereotypical approach. And, you know, I think that was what I took in the first couple chapters is, you talk about a character, I'll let you introduce him, where he first sees, you know, two people come in, and he's like, and they were African-American, and he's like, you know, we're only supposed to be orderlies, and nobody pays attention to us. Nobody even talks to us. Nobody gives us the time of day. And he saw a difference, at least that they were being addressed. I thought that was very powerful. Yeah.
So, you know, there's this guy by the name of John Moon, who is not one of the originals, but he, you know, in a lot of ways, his story reflects the larger story of Freedom House. Born in Atlanta, raised in a neighborhood in the 1950s that didn't have running water or electricity. He didn't live in the outskirts, like in some tiny, you know, in the woods out there in somewhere, Georgia. He lives in the dead center of the city, about a mile from where we're sitting right now. And he had no running water or electricity. Mother dies. He ends up in an orphanage, gets adopted by a family in Pittsburgh they didn't know he had. And he gets to Pittsburgh as this sort of, you know, it couldn't be more of an outsider, you know, in every way. And he's sort of an angry young man, but, you know, gets his way through high school and, you know, watches the civil rights movement sort of growing around him, sees the world beginning to change. You know, the 1960s are this crazy tumultuous time. He comes of age in 68. I mean, that's his senior year in high school. So this is he's seeing this change. He grew up, you know, under the heel of, you know, of oppression. There's really not any other way to say it. And, you know, is finishing high school and about to step out into the world on his own at a time when it feels as if the culture is shifting and good things are going to happen and change is on the way. And he gets into the professional world and realizes, like, none of that's true, you know. everywhere he goes, the supervisors are all white. The workers are black, and he's struggling. And he winds up as an orderly, and you immediately realize that, like taking care of people is what I'm supposed to do, but it's got to be more than this. It has to be more than bedpans and changing sheets and pushing stretchers around. But he has no idea how to make a leap. And one night he hears a radio, a two-way radio, and he stops to see what it is. And down come two men with beards, afros, and these white uniforms. And they say this sort of magical word on the sleeve, which is paramedic. And everybody responds to them. Like there is a level of respect accorded to them that he's never experienced outside of his own home. And, it's a boom, diamond in the forehead moment where he realizes that's it. That is my path. That's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. I don't know what those guys are. I don't know what the word paramedic means. I don't know anything about this, but I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that.
Well, obviously, there's so much to unpack in this book. I love how you start the book. You start the book where I believe it's John, is that right? That goes on call and psych patient, and he comes across a colleague, doesn't he? Yeah. And the colleague is not responding to law enforcement. He's they're about to escalate to force, and he says, no, I know him, and he completely diffuses the situation, and he talks about just the I guess the history of this gentleman and where he started, right? And I believe you end the book along those lines, kind of talking about that story. How did this escalate? Kind of take us fast forward and what ended up happening to the Freedom House and to those 24 paramedics, and I think that's, you start the book that way to really, right? I think it's a hook, right? It's such a powerful piece that what happened to all those guys.
Yeah. So I mean, look, as spoiler, EMS paramedics wildly successful, like hugely critical link in the chain of emergency medicine. They immediately are heralded around the country and the world. People come from all over to see what they're up to borrow bits of it. And they, in 75, they are named through the DOT, who's then in charge of it, but sort of under the guidance of a commission set up by President Gerald Ford, they are named the national standard. So the president wanted to roll out a standardized training program for paramedics, and he needed a single service to develop, field test, and then hand this thing over. Freedom House was chosen to do that. So this is not a case of like, oh, these guys came first and then they just sort of disappeared into obscurity. Like they were quite good. They were, for being in such a small city, they went toe to toe with Miami and Los Angeles and New York, and they were the city that was chosen to do this. So 75, they're named this national standard, and that's why Nancy Caroline wrote the book. Nancy Caroline was their medical director. So emergency care in the streets is the result. That's the product of Gerald Ford saying, hey, we need somebody to be a standard. That book that you read in the 70s, you read in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, like that is a book that was developed through the work and with the help of Freedom House paramedics. So unfortunately, city leadership, some of it was supportive, but a lot of it was not. And there was a tremendous amount of pushback from, the mayor. There were county commissioners who didn't like it. They had a lot of reasons that they sort of advanced as to why they didn't believe in this program, or why they didn't want to fund this program, or why they thought that Freedom House should go away. But ultimately, all of their objections, one by one, were swatted down by very logical arguments. And so they were kind of left with no logical arguments by 75. Like it was no longer plausible to say any things that they'd been saying, which is like, you can't practice medicine in a moving vehicle, or, it's not budgetarily feasible to do this. I mean, they were spending at that time more money on dog catching than they were on their paramedics. they came up with a number of different reasons why this wouldn't work. And when they finally were unable to come up with more reasons why these guys couldn't work, they simply said, okay, fine, we will embrace this. And we will set up our own paramedic group. And of course, that paramedic corps that Pittsburgh EMS is almost entirely white. So you take this group that had one or two white guys in it. They in the 70s they hired a couple white guys because they needed white people to take advantage of this federal program, which is kind of a funny story. And I talked to one of the guys who was the white dude who walked through the door. The first white dude who walked through the door is Bill Rainovich. He's got this great story. But so they went from being an organization that had one or two white guys to being replaced by an organization that had maybe one or two black guys out of dozens and dozens and dozens. So, how you feel about that, is sort of, can be to a degree sort of a litmus test. Like, do you think that it was just coincidence that this groundbreaking organization that was whose guidance was sought around the world and who was named a national standard, and who just happened to be entirely black was shut down because they were entirely black? Or, is this just a case of, the city saying, well, we're going to tweak it a little bit? It's very difficult to suggest that they were just tweaking it a little bit. And so the city replaced them. And Nancy Caroline was brought on to be the city's medical director. And she said, yes, I will do that. But in exchange, you have to hire every one of my people who wants to be hired. So after the city had already created this thing, they agree to hire the Freedom House people, but they don't have room for them. So they're all just basically third riders. They literally, this thing was already staffed without them. And so they're not allowed to do anything. Within a year, half of the people who went over had quit or been fired. They had an incredibly difficult time. They were treated really poorly. And it was quite clear the department was forced to take them, but not forced to keep them. And so there was this, very aggressive weeding out process. A handful of them, about a dozen, just said, hell no, you are not going to push me out of here. I'm going to stay. But, I can imagine that would not be, I wouldn't want to stay somewhere that it was quite clear I wasn't welcome. Yeah. But, some of them stayed. And of the people who stayed, John wound up rising to the role of assistant chief, but other people left. Mitch Brown, he was a public safety director in Cleveland and Columbus. He eventually became a state senator. You have other guys who got their masters or PhDs, MDs. Some of them went on to do, really incredible things. But, as is the case, some of the people who had the rug pulled out from them didn't recover. And among those is Ron Reagan, whose story opens and closes the book. And, Reagan was among that first group. He was one of those guys, and he was widely considered by everybody there to be the most talented paramedic that they had. He was a very quiet guy, unassuming. Somebody described him as almost like an accountant. If you see him in pictures, he's got glasses. He looks serious. By the 80s, he's homeless. And, again, it's you take somebody and you allow them to build a career for themselves and to build something that they're proud of, and then you just yank it away from them. That sort of a punch like that would be very difficult for a lot of people to recover from. And he's he's somebody who didn't. And I think he's also, he and John sort of make up the yin and yang of this story. Of a guy who held on and did well in the face of all this, and then a guy who succumbed to it. It's really, it can be a very frustrating story, but it's also, ultimately, it's a very hopeful story. You see what people are capable of. You see what perseverance can do, what opportunity. That's maybe most importantly, what opportunity can do for a group of people that the world had counted out.
Yeah, and I think that's something in all of our lives. You see people that have a major life event, a struggle, right? And you take two people, as you just said, they both had the rug pulled out. They both obviously were offered those jobs. One ended up going assistant chief. The other one ended up homeless. That's maybe a different conversation. That's always something that I struggle with is what's the difference, right? Is it its personality? Is it a trait? Is it something else that happened in his life that really did derail, right? It's just,
you take two siblings,
yeah. Oh yeah.
You take two siblings, same house, same parents, same means, same race, like all things being equal, these two people should have landed in the same spot, and yet they didn't. Everybody responds to these things differently,
So if you could, what was the most profound thing that you came away through other research, writing the book? What do you think was the big thing that if you could even put a finger on something that really moved you or changed your thought process about society, maybe, or our profession? Was there anything?
Yeah, there's a guy who he came in with the second class, didn't necessarily want to be his name's George, didn't necessarily want to be a paramedic, definitely didn't want to go to school, but he's in his late teens, early 20s, and his grandmother says, if you don't get a job, I'm kicking you out of the house. So now he's got to do something. And he hears about Freedom House, and he looks at this 9-month schooling, and he's like, man, I don't know about this. But again, he's up against it. So he decides to do it, but he says, the only reason I'm going to finish this is to prove, he says to his grandmother, the only reason I'm doing this is to prove to you that I can. That's it. That's his motivation, is to show her that he can do something. And so he does. He enters into this and immediately gets, very quickly when he starts the job, gets caught up in it, and it sort of carries him, and he's like, man, this is really something incredible. And he hadn't really done anything big yet, but there was something about the medicine that drew him in. And then he's a few weeks in, he's new, and we all remember what it's like to be new. You really don't know what the hell's going on. And he gets called to a cardiac arrest, and they go down and they're, CPR and the whole, shocks, the whole bit. They bring this guy into the hospital, and by the time he gets to the emergency room, the guy's got a pulse, and very quickly he's talking to the doctors and the nurses, and it's late at night. You know how everything has a weird feeling late at night. And he's in the corner of the room, and he's watching this sort of, flood of people that have come in, the doctors and nurses, whoever, the techs, and everybody that's surrounding this guy, and who's now talking. And he's looking at this person who had just a few moments ago had been dead, and now this guy was alive. And George he's blown away by this experience, and he just keeps thinking, I did that. I did that. Like, whatever just happened, whatever, wherever you want to put it on a spiritual, religious, physical sense, like, I brought this person back from wherever they were. And now he's talking, and it was this eye-opening moment for him. And he said at that point, like, this is it. This is what I want to do. Like, and he's so moved by this experience that throughout his time, through all the challenges he faced, and, he had patients who didn't want them to touch him because they were white and he was black, and they fought with police, and they had all the troubles that they had. He claims never to have blinked, that it never, none of it ever affected him because the medicine was so profound. And this is a kid who didn't have any interest in any of this, who didn't want to go to school, who enters into this program because his grandmother's going to kick him out, and he sticks around simply to prove to her that he can do something. And yet he finds, his piece of this profound thing, and he's just going to hold on to it. And that to me was, that stuck with me. That really stuck with me. Just the importance of this job, the way that this job can transcend, going to work and punching in and doing your hours and, punching out at the end of the night to go home. Like, there is something more to it. And people can feel that, and it can be transformative. it's difficult now because we've been at it so long that, you know, it feels more like a job, a bit perhaps less like a discovery. But, you know, go back to when you were brand new and you first had that, the very first time that somebody pulled back the curtain and showed you what was, you know, the first time you saw the wizard, and you realize like, oh man, I'm the one pulling those gears. You know, that, considering that this happened in the 60s and he and I were having this conversation in 2018, 2019, and he still felt that magic, you know, I mean, that says all you need to know about the job and all you need to know about like why they continue to do it. They, over and over again, these guys said, you know, we weren't trying to change the world. We didn't know we were leading a revolution. We didn't know that this was going to change everything. We believed in the job. Like, we believed in what we were doing. We knew that something good was going to come out of this, and we just weren't going to be turned away. And I don't know. I mean, if you can't feel that, then I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's powerful. I mean, it really is. And I think we each have our own experience with, you know, that first call, that first patient, maybe that first save, things that we still carry with us. And I was actually just thinking about that a few weeks ago, about how easily we could become, you know, you're seeing a lot of people exit the industry, whether that's paramedics or even nurses that are just, you know, they feel overworked and underappreciated and underpaid. And, you know, again, we there's lots of reasons, but I think we forget about why we started this job, right? And it's easy to forget that, right? When you've worked a 24-hour shift and you've ran 15, 18 calls and you are just exhausted, and you know, you're going on your fourth homeless person that is just abusing maybe the system, and it's that sixth one though that calls and says they have chest pain. The other ones just wanted a warm bed to sleep in, that'll get you, right? And so I think that goes into cognitive bias, and it goes into complacency. And I think we have to constantly be able to reset ourselves and remember where we started. And you know, I think what's powerful for me hearing the story about George is they had extra obstacles. I mean, let's just be honest.
Yeah.
Whether you have experienced racism in some way, you know, I think I've learned with friends that I have that are African American that they are treated different in some circumstances. There is situations maybe that you and I would not feel uncomfortable where they will, right? And so I think it's really easy. As I get older, I'm more aware that just because we don't know how that feels, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen, right? And so I think that's what's also amazing about this is we have to have an awareness of diversity. And we've come so far just in the last, 5-10 years.
Yeah.
Obviously the 60s, that was a different time. And I think I told you this when we met. That was one of the key things that struck me was I applaud you for telling this story, right? It needed to be told. So very honored to be able to sit with you and hear about your experiences. And I just really encourage people to grab this book and read it. I think it will definitely allow you to reflect on maybe your career, and that, there's a lot of history within our profession. You look at the nursing profession and how old that is. And you said something very powerful. It's paramedicine. It's been a blink, right? We often get frustrated with where we're at in the industry compared to the nursing industry, and how organized they are, and the unions and the pay level and the degree requirements, and how everything for the most part is on a even playing field, right? And that EMS is not. It is different in every state. There's not a consistent method, but right, it's been a blink. Right? We have a long way to go. We just have to learn from the people that came before us, and I think it's important to know the origins of. I know for me, the most rewarding part of my work experience has been as a paramedic. You know, it's something that I've wanted to do since I was 4 or 5 years old, right? And I mean that. I was that kid. Like I'd get upset. I mean, I remember if we were late coming home from work, or the babysitter, you know, this is kindergarten, and I wanted to watch emergency. I mean, it was a big deal. And you know, my dad was a police officer, and my mom and my dad had been already divorced, and she met a fire captain, paid department, and so then I got to live that my whole childhood, right? And so, you know, it truly. I remember the first day I had that paramedic patch on my arm, and obviously it's still emotional for me because I know how bad I wanted it. I know how hard I worked, and I was so honored to be able to wear that patch, right? And it's easy to forget that.
Yeah.
It really is. So, you know, this is just another level of a story that's even, I feel, more impactful, that man, the things that they went through to start this profession, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's crazy. And, you know, one of the shocking things is how little has changed. You know, the things that they were going through in 60s and 70s, you know, we've been sort of recycling the last couple of years. A lot of those same problems and questions and
absolutely
divisions, you know, are sitting in front of us right now, which is really, you know, sort of frustrating and mind-blowing. But, you know, even none of this is all that old. It is, you know, it is really like this story ended, you know, almost seconds before I was born. And I'm not that old. So the story is not that old. And those challenges are new, and they are fresh and ongoing, you know. And so it's definitely important to, you know, like there's that phrase, you know, everybody you meet is going through something, be kind. You know, I think that certainly applies to these sort of issues, you know, like everyone, you know, there are various battles to fight, and, you know, not everybody's, you know, given the same weapons to fight them with, you know. It's not an even battlefield, unfortunately.
Sure. Well, you know, again, I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, man.
It's been really good. Excited to be able to finish the book, and excited to be able to put this podcast out. You know, do you have any, you know, if anybody has any questions, we can, we'll maybe put your email in the show notes, and you can, you know, field things through email or however you want. Obviously, I think a lot of the stuff within the book can be, you know, you got to read the book, but,
yeah.
Anything else you want to talk about?
I mean, I could talk all day about this subject, so I'll leave it up to you, you know.
Yeah, well, I think this is good, you know, and I, you know, maybe we meet again and we do something else, but I think this will definitely spark an interest and get people talking, and I think that's the key. This is definitely a different type of episode. You know, the FlightBridgeED Podcast has always been critical care medicine focused, very specific on that, and I'm starting to kind of branch out into, you know, culture and diversity and having these tough discussions. I think we have to do that, and I think it's needed right now. So I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to meet with me.
Man. Yeah, anytime.
All right, guys. Well, as always, if you have any questions, you have episode ideas, case studies, please reach out, eric.bauer@flightbridgeed.com, and we will see you again.
This has been a production of the FlightBridgeED Podcast, leading the way in pre-hospital critical care and emergency medicine education.